Mystery swirls around the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party, and several members of the upper echelons have suddenly disappeared from public view. Among them are the former Foreign Minister Qin Gang and Minister for Defence Li Shangfu. Does it signify vicious political infighting, or could there be more prosaic reasons for their sudden absence? I'm joined by a Member of Parliament who has perhaps more expertise on China than anyone else in the House of Commons. Mark Logan spent several years at the British Consulate in Shanghai. Mark, it's a great pleasure to have you on GB News. Welcome.
Very good afternoon. Thank you, Michael.
What do you make of what's happening in the upper reaches of the Communist Party?
Well, I think the two names that you mentioned, there may be two different things happening. One, in the case of Qin Gang, potentially looking at a personal issue related to his private life when he was ambassador for China to the United States. In the case of Li Shangfu, there has been reports around potential corruption. So I think, your question implicitly is asking, is there some bigger movement happening within the Communist Party of China, indeed factionalism taking place? And of course, that could be the case, because even though a lot of times as Western observers, we like to think as the Communist Party to be this monolithic entity, but actually, because it doesn't have a multi-party system like we do, it ends up within its own party. It has to have these factions and this pull and push factor happening.
Yeah, but you think it's not a systemic problem, and I think you're saying that the president is not in any way threatened. I mean, from the outside, we would look at the policies that they pursued, for example, during COVID, which did lead to protests and did lead to a reversal of the national policy. And I would have thought a considerable loss of face. But has all of that been left behind?
Well, I think it's interesting to say this because we go back away at the start of 2020, and you could argue that in those initial few months, the first year, that China had a relatively good pandemic in terms of its lockdowns, in terms of keeping COVID numbers incredibly low throughout the country. But then you fast forward to the tail end of last year, and as you rightly pointed out, some of the protests that were happening in cities like Shanghai, like Beijing, even in the northwest of China. And people, again, were looking into that to see if there was some wider discontent happening. And I think, to an extent, but then, this not kind of, I think, over-exaggerate, because we're talking about probably the low thousands of people that were taking to the streets at that time in, for example, Shanghai. But I still do think that the last year and a half, it's been incredibly difficult for China economically. That, of course, has had an impact on its domestic politics, and I also think it's had an impact on its international relations. So maybe going back to your point about the changes at the top higher echelons of the Communist Party, us as British people and the UK government looking at China will be interested to see if there is indeed any policy changes, and indeed if we need to realign how we interact with China.
The growth rate is well down. Is that a critical point? I mean, I'd been kind of led to believe that you needed very high growth rates to hold China together, but maybe that's too simplistic. Well,
I think for a very long time, some of the great China thinkers, a lot tend to be based in the United States. One professor, David Shambaugh, and as he often talked about going back 10, 15 years, is that the Communist Party tends to have two levers. One is economics, and the other tends to be on the nationalism front. So I think it's in everyone's interest that China continues to do well economically. It's the world's second biggest economy after the United States. The US and China are the two big engines of growth. So I do think that it's important that China keeps that growth and tries to get growth back to where it was kind of pre-pandemic levels as much as possible. But we have seen in the wider East Asia region that there has been a slowing in growth, and recent reports have also been looking at Southeast Asia, or indeed South Asia, as potentially being a third engine coming through in the years to come.
Tell me what it's like to be a China watcher. Maybe a little bit about your experience in China, your linguistic abilities, and how one can study such an opaque system.
I think that's what attracted me to China, actually. This is something I find when I'm looking in the UK in recent years. Actually, there have been as many people, if not more, seeking to study Japanology or to go and study Korean studies. And sometimes I find it unfortunate, because China, from a personal point of view and from a cultural point of view, is a fantastic country. It has a fantastic history, going back 3,800 years. And the language is just incredibly interesting. So I actually found perhaps that opacity in the Chinese system is what attracted it to me. Perhaps for some people who were Sovietologists going back 34 years ago, something quite similar. So whenever we're asked, I suppose, to analyse the upper echelons of the Chinese system, I think, well, I spent a good few years working there, private sector and public sector, and still that invisible hand, and not that hand of Adam Smith, but that of the Communist Party in China, is one that's very difficult to decipher, and also the extent to which it has support within China, but also its power as well can be quite both visible and invisible at the same time.
I saw someone making a good point about open sources. In other words, that the Chinese tend to tell you in public speeches what they intend to do, and rather more than perhaps in European countries, they actually achieve what they set out to do. So our public source is quite an important source.
I actually do think so, and I was reminded that it was someone like Tony Blair actually had said this 15, 20 years ago, is that you should actually listen to a Chinese politician or leader's speech, because they'll end up trying to do, or will indeed do, most of the stuff that they out in the speech. That, I think, comes down to, a UK, China, or a Western liberal democracy and the Chinese system. There is an inherent challenge and battle here, because in the UK, as you can appreciate, former MP Michael, is that there's a real pull towards short-termism and responding to the latest Twitter post that's going out. Within the Chinese system, they don't have that same pressure to respond to things instantaneously. They do have their 5-year economic plans, and for the most part can plan much more in the long term than we're able to do.
We're all very anxious about Taiwan. What would your advice be to us about Taiwan?
I think we need to tread very carefully, because from my understanding, and I was in DC just last week, is that the United States wouldn't want us in the UK from an official position doing something with Taiwan or in Taiwan, which would make the United States or indeed their leaders look weak within DC and across their constituents. So I do think we need to decrease the temperature as much as possible on the Taiwan issue, but at the same time is recognising that there has to be a peaceful reconciliation in the cross straits.
Sorry, what does that mean? Does that mean that Taiwan has to become part of the People's Republic?
No, what it means is that both sides, whether it's within Taiwan or indeed within the People's Republic of China, is that there has to be a concerted effort to make sure that trade happens as much as possible. There's people-to-people exchanges, because as we've seen in recent times, whether it's on the eastern borders of Europe, European Union, or indeed just over the weekend in Israel, is that fighting and conflict is in no one's interest.
Some people say that China is determined to resolve the Taiwan issue without fighting. I assume that's something we can't actually rely upon.
I mean, the thing is that at the moment, Taiwan, I think, it has been itself, although not recognised as a country in the international community. The UK, we don't have an official relationship with Taiwan, but we do have a lot of interaction with Taiwan. We have a representative office there, and likewise within London from Taiwan as well. And it's got a great amount to offer, again, whether culturally, whether in terms of technology and innovation. We know that they've got a massive chip operation as well, semiconductor within Taiwan itself. So it's incredibly important that there is a way even to find the status quo and to keep the status quo in effect for as long as possible.
And if by chance you weren't able to continue your parliamentary career, would your interest in China be lifelong, do you think?
Absolutely, yes. Both in China and also actually in the last year, I've taken up an interest in Japan as well. I'm trying to learn Japanese along with Mandarin, because I thought the Chinese would help me, but actually it's been a bit of a hindrance and it's confused me in the last few months.
Mark Logan, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michael.
The studio.